Welcome and thank you for joining us for this evening's lecture in the lecture series Control, Coercion and Constraint. It's my privilege to present today's speaker, Dr. Julia Winnebeck. Julia Winnebeck is a brilliant scholar, a good colleague and a dear friend here at the University of Bonn. She has studied theology in Heidelberg and Bonn and did her PhD studies in Bonn and at the University of Oxford. In her PhD thesis, she explored the so-called Apostolicum-Streitigkeiten in the late 19th century Germany. In her PhD thesis, currently Julia Winnebeck is a research group leader at the Bonn Center for Dependency Studies. Here she does her own research as well as supervise PhD students that are working on structures of dependency in the late antique and early medieval Western Church. Julia Winnebeck has a remarkable talent of finding and dealing with historical topics in a way that is relevant and engaging beyond her own field of study. Among her latest publications, you find interesting articles such as Handling Abortion, an exemplary study of the independence of late antique and early medieval penance, and another article, Slaves and Slavery in the Late Antique and Early Medieval Penitentials. I look forward to hear this evening's lecture with the title, Serving God, Structures of Dependency in the Ecclesiastical Realm. Julia, the floor is yours.
Hello, good evening, and thank you, Maria, for the kind introduction. In my talk today, I want to explore the role of late antique and early medieval, the late antique and early medieval Western Church in establishing and perpetuating structures of asymmetrical dependency. And now that's where I wanted to be. For this purpose, I will look specifically into the system of penance as a medium of social control and a gateway to dependency relations such as slavery and bonded labor. So what is penance? The term penance, as you may well know, describes the Church's practice of awarding punishment for sin. This practice was first introduced in early Christianity as a means to repent for sins committed after conversion and baptism. The earliest church councils and church father writings describe penance as a fairly regulated system with several tiers. The penitents underwent a very public and probably quite humiliating process of wailing, kneeling, knocking, and so on. On completion of their penance, they were finally welcomed back into the Christian community, which was symbolized through the imposition of hands and the participation in the Eucharist. The whole process was understood to cleanse the penitents from sin, like baptism had done before, so that they would be prepared to face God's judgment in the afterlife. From the 6th century onwards, a slightly different form of penance is conveyed to us through the existence of the so-called penitentials. These relatively short handbooks elaborate on a range of different sins and recommend appropriate punishments. According to the severity of the sin, the penitential punishments vary greatly in length and rigor. Whereas minor sins could be repented for example, by the singing of psalms or very short periods of fasting, severe crimes required lengthy periods of fasting, often socially isolated from the community and in connection to additional sanctions like exile, confinement, compensation payments, and even forms of enslavement. Even though today only about 300 to 400 manuscripts containing penitential texts remain, it is thought that they were widely circulated at the time and formed part of the basic equipment of the clergy in Francia and beyond. There is, however, an ongoing discussion about the penitential's context of application. They can be read as witnesses for a pious practice of Christians that took the form of the confession of one's sins to a cleric and their subsequent remission via the process of penance. But alternatively, they can also be perceived as witnesses to the fact that the local churches and monasteries acted as a sort of court which handled civil as well as criminal matters. These two readings are, of course, not mutually exclusive. Regardless of their application context, the penitentials provide an invaluable source for both theological research and social history, as they inform us, often unknowingly, about contemporary matters of ethical, legal, and spiritual concern. One particular area which might benefit from further research on the penitentials are slavery and dependency studies. After decades of pronounced disregard, studies into slavery have finally rediscovered late antiquity and the early Middle Ages as eras of interest. These studies have given up on former approaches which focused on detecting continuities and discontinuities between the Roman form of slavery and newer forms of dependency. For example, by trying to pinpoint the change from an agrarian and slave-based economy to feudalism or the transition from slaves to serfs. Instead, scholars like Alice Ryo have argued for the continued existence and cultural relevance of traditional chattel-type forms of slavery alongside a variety of other forms of dependency, and have based those claims, among other sources, on the penitentials. At the same time, the perception of the relationship between the Christian church and slavery has changed. Most scholars today reject the ideological narrative of former generations, according to which Christianity worked as a major force towards the abolition of slavery by the Middle Ages, and instead accept the notion of the church as a major slave-owning institution. However, the discussion on the extent of the church's active involvement with slavery and the theological rationale behind this is ongoing and still in need of further research. Against this backdrop, I want to first present the evidence suggesting that penitential penance did have a fundamentally social dimension and could therefore be exploited as a medium of social control. In the second part of this talk, I will then move on to the evidence indicating a more direct involvement of ecclesial institutions with practices like penal enslavement and bonded labor via the system of penance. The first generation of penitentials, which my research focuses on, are penitentials written between the late 6th and the early 8th centuries. These penitentials are also sometimes called small or simple because, unlike later ones, they largely represent only one tradition and only occasionally refer directly to conciliar legislation. The first generation of penitentials is made up of altogether 5 Irish penitentials, a closely linked group of 8 Frankish penitentials, and the Anglo-Saxon penitential ascribed to the school of Theodore of Canterbury. These penitentials contain 2 types of evidence pertaining to the social dimension of penance. The first are hints to means of exercising pressure that could be and possibly were employed to enforce penance. The second type of evidence concerns the character of penitential punishments. A range of sins are sanctioned with compensation payments, corporal punishments, exile, or even enslavement, all of which indicate the notion of penance as a penal or legal measure rather than a purely spiritual exercise. Particularly the early Irish penitentials, most of which probably originated in a monastic context in the 6th and early 7th centuries, contain evidence to suggest that non-repentant sinners were put under pressure to undergo penance. In order to enforce certain behaviors or to exact a confession, sinners were not only to be excluded from the celebration of the Eucharist, but were considered anathema to all Christians. The vast majority of evidence for this demand of social exclusion can be found in the Ambrosianum and the Penitential of Cumian, where the casting out of the sinner, or a sort of a staggered excommunication, appears to be the first reaction to encountering sin. The notion of sin as a spreading infection, which needed to be cut out immediately in order to protect the rest of the body, seems to have formed the background to this measure. I quote Cumian, "He, however, who will not confess to him who has incensed him, that pestilential person shall be cut off from the company of the saints. If he repents, he shall do penance for as long as he was recalcitrant." So in practice, this may have meant that other members of the respective Christian community were banned from any social interaction with the sinner who was, temporarily or permanently, considered socially dead. In most instances, the penitential canons in question seem to envision the context of a close-knit monastic community where the disobedient were to remain outside the assembly without food and knock humbly. One provision in the earliest extant penitential, the penitential of Finian, goes a step further still in demanding that the sinner be driven from his country and beaten with rods until he is converted if he has compunction. As regards lay people, the penitential of Theodore suggests that in addition to imposing the social stigma connected to the exclusion from Mass and the Eucharist, the ecclesial institutions may have had additional options at their disposal to enforce penance. For repeated breaches of the Sunday observance, the penitentials proposed flogging or the confiscation of part of the property. And to adulterous women, the penitential kindly offered penance in monastic confinement as a way to preserve at least some of their inheritance. I'm quoting Theodore. If a woman is an adulteress and her husband does not wish to live with her, if she decides to enter a monastery, she shall retain the fourth part of her inheritance. If she decides otherwise, she shall have nothing. So the very popular method of either threat or bribery always does the trick, really. The second type of evidence pertaining to the social dimension of penance are the types of punishments we find in them. Particularly the Irish and the Anglo-Saxon handbooks of penance contain plenty of provisions in which the punishment consists of an extended fast, which one might consider the actual penance, and one or more other sanctions, which one would perhaps rather associate with institutions other than penance. For instance, as we've just heard, the penitentials occasionally prescribe corporal punishments, either as a means to enforce penance or as a sanction for sin. Corporal punishments seem to have been largely reserved to lower clergy and adolescents, though. The same limitation of a set of punishments to a specific group of people applies, of course, to disciplinary measures like deposition, degradation, or the ban from entering higher office, which the penitentials could, for obvious reasons, only impose on their own staff. Reasons for these disciplinary sanctions include mainly sins of fornication, but also office violations, such as stealing, failing to baptize sick people or newborns, and superstitious practices. Most frequently, however, the punishment prescribed in addition to fasting consists of the demand for compensation, Latin satisfactio. Especially the penitentials of the Irish and Anglo-Saxon traditions frequently assign satisfactio for sins and crimes that were considered grave or disruptive, like bodily harm, fornication, theft, or manslaughter. The term is predominantly used in the sense of an actual financial compensation for the harm done. If, for example, a layman physically hurt another, he was ordered to pay a certain amount to cover for the doctor's bills and the financial loss the injured suffered due to being ill or disabled following the attack. So a good example for this sort of compensation can be found in Cumian again. And this reads as follows. He who by a blow in a quarrel renders a man incapacitated or maimed shall meet the injured man's medical expenses and shall make good the damages for the deformity and shall do his work until he is healed and do penance for half a year. Compensation in the form of payments or sanctions resulting in financial loss are also required for sins of fornication. For instance, in the case of a man having sexual intercourse with a married woman, he was expected to pay the betrayed husband her chastity price. In case a man had sexual relations with an unmarried woman, the male sinner was to either marry her or pay her legal guardians a compensation. The punishment for fornication with unfree dependents consisted of either the obligation to sell them or to set them free. In the case of theft, the penitentials usually demanded the restitution of the stolen goods or the value thereof. Sometimes the canons required the two- or even fourfold restitution. Compensation payments could also reduce the length of the prescribed penance. Conversely, and this is, I think, where it gets really interesting, the penitentials provide information on what happened if the sinners were not able to meet the compensation claims. As an alternative to payment or restitution, they allowed for an extension of the fast. We can find an example for this possibility in the context of the provision on bodily harm displayed here. For after ordering satisfactio in Canon 9, Canon 10 continues, if he has not the wherewithal to make restitution for these things, he shall do penance for 1 year, so 6 months extra. In those cases, the Church may have foregone or covered the compensation in return for the penitent being indebted to pay alms or work in its service. At least this seems to be suggested, for instance, in the following canon. This was so long I had to skip the Latin. If any layman has committed theft, that is, has stolen an ox or a horse or a sheep or any beast of his neighbor's, if he has done it once or twice, let him first restore to his neighbor the loss which he has caused, and let him do penance for 3 40-day periods on bread and water. But if he has made a practice of stealing often and cannot make restitution, let him do penance for 1 year and 3 40-day periods, and further undertake not to repeat it, and thus let him communicate at Easter of the 2nd year, that is, after 2 years, on condition that, out of his own labor, he first gives alms to the poor and a meal to the priest who adjudged his penance, and so let the guilt of his evil habit be forgiven. Satisfactio, in the form of bonded labor, is also indicated as penitential punishment for cases of bodily harm or murder. For instance, the penitential of Columban and several Frankish penitentials decreed that murderers should undergo penance in exile for 3 years and should render their services to the relatives of their victim on their return. So, whoever has committed murder, that is, has killed his neighbor, let him do penance 3 years on bread and water as an unarmed exile, and after 3 years let him return to his own, rendering the compensation of filial piety and duty to the relatives of the slain, and thus after making satisfaction, let him be restored to the altar at the discretion of the priest. Similarly, other provisions in the Irish penitentials ordered sinners to offer themselves, that is probably their services, in place of their deceased or injured victims. Provisions like these suggest that at least in some communities, the penance for certain offenses entailed lasting obligations to the injured party in the form of dependent labor. As you can maybe tell by the picture, I'm coming to the second part of my paper. As indicated earlier, the penitentials also occasionally assign sanctions that suggest a more direct involvement of ecclesial institutions with penal enslavement and bonded labor. In addition to the punishments just covered, the late antique and early medieval penitentials contain provisions which prescribe enslavement and an ambiguous sort of service to God as sanctions for certain sins. For example, people who committed severe forms of fornication, that is, for example, adultery, were punished with enslavement or condemned to comparable relations of asymmetrical dependency. The Irish penitential of Finian, for example, ordered adulterous women to serve their husband in the place of a slave, whereby the author indicated the descent of such sinners to the bottom of the social order in their own household. I have already discussed this canon with a couple of people present here today, but I'm showing it again because I think it's a great example of how complex or weird, or whatever you want to call it, these penitential provisions are. If a man's wife commits fornication and cohabits with another man, he ought not to take another wife while his first wife is alive, in the hope that, perchance, she be converted to penance, and it is becoming to take her back if she fully and freely seeks this. But she shall not pay dowry to him, or you could also read, he shall not pay dowry to her. There's evidence of both ways of payment being exchanged, so it's unclear from the Latin who pays what. And she shall serve her former husband as long as he is in the body. She shall make amends in the place of a male or female slave in all loyalty and subjection. The Anglo-Saxon penitential of Theodore II lists adultery among the offences sanctioned with enslavement in a provision which was apparently concerned with the right to remarry. If a husband makes himself a slave through theft or fornication or any sin, the wife, if she has not been married before, has the right to take another husband after a year. This is not permitted to one who has been twice married. While this canon clearly does not order penal enslavement itself, it provides guidance for the event that a spouse had been enslaved after committing a sin. The fact that this is almost casually mentioned as a common occurrence which required further legislation makes this provision all the more interesting as a reference to this practice. Anyway, one might say that so far we have not seen any evidence that the Church ever enforced penal enslavement itself, or that it was directly involved with the supervision of penally enslaved people. Rather, in the examples presented, the injured parties were the ones envisioned to enforce the dependency relations. So in the one example, the betrayed husband, and in the other example, the grieving relatives, even if both parties did so with the explicit sanction of the Church. At least the penitential of Theodore, however, contains further provisions which indicate a more direct involvement of the Church with the practice of penal enslavement. If any layman carries off a monk from the monastery by stealth, he shall either enter a monastery to serve God or subject himself to human servitude. This canon indicates that under circumstances in which the Church's jurisdiction was indisputable, like in this example, for instance, because it was itself the offended party, it would not only order, but possibly also enforce the penal enslavement itself. The alternative given here, that is between human slavery or entering a monastery, seems rather strange at first. It possibly simply served to lay out different options to the person adjudging penance. The priests could either assign forced monasticism or the subjection to human servitude, depending on the circumstances of the offense and the quality of the offender, or depending on whether there was a fitting monastery in the vicinity which would readily accept another criminal. The alternative thus, however, also suggests that both options, forced monasticism and human servitude, were considered equally undesirable to the average free Christian. A third provision in the penitential of Theodore, finally, offers a hint that in addition to acknowledging and decreeing penal enslavement for certain offenses, the ecclesial institutions may have acquired criminals as slaves by paying or foregoing whatever compensation they owed. A bishop or an abbot may keep a criminal as a slave if he, that is the criminal, has not the means of redeeming himself. This last provision could be read against the backdrop of penitential provisions assigning compensation, or it could be understood against the background that most legal codes of the post-Roman successor states ordered compensation payments rather than corporal punishments for the majority of offenses. These compensations were, in all likelihood, difficult to pay for most individuals, and therefore, like the compensation payments ordered by the penitentials, may have provided a slippery slope into penal enslavement or debt bondage. A second group of canons which indicate that sinners or criminals were inflicted with lasting obligations to ecclesial institutions via the system of penance are provisions that assign forced monasticism or non-specific services to God as a punishment. Like penal enslavement, these punishments are exclusively awarded for grave offenses such as repeated theft, abduction, perjury, treason, and manslaughter. The severity of those sins probably required the penitent to be removed from their current social community for the duration of their penance, or most of the time, in fact, till the end of their life. As is still fairly palpable in some of these provisions, the punishments of forced monasticism and service to God probably developed out of the more traditional punishment of exile, which the earlier penitentials also prescribed from time to time. For instance, the Irish penitential of Cumian punished repeated stealing with, I quote, the yoke of exile under another abbot. While this canon addressed monks who were, in the best case scenario, simply moved from one monastery to another, other provisions inform us that the same punishment could be applied to lay people too. This is interesting, as other known sources witnessing to monastic confinement or forced monasticism as a punishment, namely the council records, almost exclusively prescribe it to clerics. As we have already seen earlier, the penitential of Theodore sanctioned abduction with either human servitude or forced entry of a monastery. The same penitential also assigns lifelong penance in a monastery to people who committed multiple offenses. He who has committed many evil deeds, that is, murder, adultery with a woman and with a beast, and theft, shall go into a monastery and do penance until his death. The penitential of Columban prescribed lifelong penance in a monastery for cases of perjury and ordered the penitents to receive the tonsure, or maybe just to have their heads shaved, who knows. That could also just be like a sign of their status as penitents. While all of the Frankish penitentials have omitted this obscure punishment from their version of Columban's provision, it later reappears in an unpublished penitential which is preserved in a 9th century manuscript in Düsseldorf. If any layman has perjured himself out of greed, he shall sell all his things and give to the poor, and receive the tonsure, or shall be shaved, in a monastery, and there he shall serve God until the day of his death. Several other canons did not specify the place of exile or punishment as a monastery, but still indicated some sort of connection of the prescribed exile or prescribed penance to an ecclesial institution. The penitential of Theodore and the Bigotian penitential, for example, decreed that sinners who had killed members of the clergy give up their arms and serve God. If one slays a monk or a cleric, he shall lay aside his arms and serve God, or he shall do penance for 7 years. He is in the judgment of his bishop. But as for one who slays a bishop or a presbyter, it is for the king to give judgment in his case. The penitential of Cumian featured the curious additional information that such penitents were considered dead to the world during their lifelong service to God. He who commits murder through nursing hatred in his mind shall, after having given up his arms, live unto God, being dead to the world until his own death. This, being dead to the world, could be interpreted to refer to either the remoteness of the service, for example in a monastery, or the social status of the penitents as the dependents of an ecclesial institution. All in all, one could say that the punishments of penal enslavement and monastic exile or forced service to the church are fairly well attested as punishments for severe crimes within the early penitential texts. In assigning these curious punishments, the penitentials bear witness to a general shift within the penal system from classic forms of exile to forms of monastic confinement and penal servitude, which Julia Hillner has firmly established in her book, Prison, Punishment and Penance in Late Antiquity. So I'm coming to my conclusion now. The character of the penitential punishments and the available means to enforce them show that penance can indeed be understood as a fundamentally social institution. This is not to say that it did not also have a spiritual dimension, and in my last paper I've tried to show exactly that spiritual dimension of penance. However, if one looks at penance from the perspective of social history, as I have done today, it seems obvious that it also served the purpose to uphold a certain social or ethical order and to settle conflicts within the local Christian community. Particularly the Irish penitentials and the Anglo-Saxon penitential of Theodore indicate a historical context in which penitentials were used in place of, rather than in addition to, other legal norms. Much like monastic rules, the majorities of their provisions seem to postulate a closed-off monastic environment where lay people too were among the dependents of the ecclesial institution awarding penance, if not in an economical sense, then with respect to social conduct and legal proceedings. By comparison, the Frankish penitentials contain barely any evidence pertaining to the social dimension of penance. In fact, their compilers seem to have eliminated references to punishments other than fasting from the Irish material they included, with the exception of the homicide canons. The lack of direct evidence for penance taking the form of public punishments other than fasting might point to a different application context or Sitz im Leben of the Frankish penitentials compared to those of the Irish and Anglo-Saxon tradition. Perhaps they found application in a context where ecclesial institutions did not have extensive legal authority, and accordingly, punishments of a more secular character could not hope to be enforced. Regardless of whether the penitential punishments, including the assignment of extended fasts, are understood as additional or the sole sanctions for the listed offenses, their enforcement obviously required a significant degree of authority or power on the part of the Church, and or the support of these sanctions by secular authorities. This is, of course, especially true for sanctions that entail the permanent or temporary entry into dependency relations. Even though these punishments cannot exactly be regarded as an invention of the Christian Church, in light of the evidence presented today, it seems fair to say that the imposition of significant dependencies as a means to sanction certain sins or crimes was certainly promoted within the system of penance. More importantly, the sources indicate that ecclesial institutions functioned as an administrative channel for these practices. Perhaps local priests administering penance took on the role of a modern-day notary. Exchanges of workforce for debt resulting from civil or criminal proceedings were processed by and through the Church, which not only had the financial means to pay out compensations, but also the authority and resources to draw up official documents to testify to these agreements and enough possibilities to hold and employ dependents. Sadly, the penitentials themselves do not provide much information on the events following the assignment of the penitential punishments, or indeed on whether they were ever applied in practice, and neither do historiographic sources tell us much about this. However, further research into the so-called formulae, which are model drafts of legal agreements between two parties, might offer more details on the process of assigning penal enslavement and bonded labor as punishments for sin. What we do know, however, is that the Church, or rather its higher representatives, ruled over several groups of dependents. Other than its own staff, these included slaves, which ecclesial institutions got hold of by way of donation, inheritance, and or as part of properties it acquired. However, the precise character of their lives or of the service to the Church in a monastery or elsewhere remains ambiguous. We have no evidence that the social status of slaves was altered on entry into the service of the Church. Neither do the provisions which inform us on the practice of forced monasticism or penal service to God indicate that people subjected to these punishments were necessarily turned into proper monks and nuns. The assessment of the circumstances and living conditions of church dependence, like the assessment of any type of dependency really, therefore needs to take into account other factors than merely the legal status of these dependents as free or slaves, or their association with a certain institution, such as the Church. These factors may be, for example, the dependent's gender, age, and last but not least, the type of work they were assigned. While this evidence is of course sparse and often rather hidden, put together, it might provide us with a better view of the Church's handling of slavery and other dependency relations. For instance, the sources indicate that slaves did indeed work on monastic premises in all sorts of different functions, for example, as personal servants or simply in the function of rural laborers. One particularly interesting canon in the records of the Council of Eppau sanctioned the sale of slaves for the simple reason that it would be unfair on monks to perform their hard agricultural labor. Slaves who have been donated to the monks may not be freed by the abbot, for we consider it unjust that while monks perform the daily rural labor, their slaves have the leisure of freedom. Furthermore, there are several hints in the extant sources to slaves living and working in the households of members of the clergy, most notably in conciliar legislation concerned with the presence of female slaves and the temptation they provided. These examples suggest that the reality of serving God, or rather the church, may not have differed much at all from dependency relations outside the ecclesial realm. Rather, the reality of church dependence, like that of other dependents, was down to a range of factors, the careful consideration of which will produce some interesting findings in the future. Thank you for your attention.